Chapter 28 of The Money Moon by Jeffrey Farnol. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 28, which tells how Bellew left Dapplemere in the dawn. Far in the east a grey streak marked the advent of another day, and upon all things was a solemn hush, a great and awful stillness that was like the stillness of death. The earth was a place of gloom and mist, where spectral shadows writhed and twisted and flitted under a frowning heaven, and out of the gloom there came a breath sharp and damp and exceeding chill. Therefore, as Bellew gazed down from the frowning heaven to the gloom of earth below, with its ever-moving misty shapes, he shivered involuntarily. In another hour it would be day, and with the day the gates of Arcadia would open for his departure, and he must go forth to become once more a wanderer, going up and down and to and fro in the world until his course was run. And yet it was worth having lived for, this one golden month, and in all his wanderings needs must he carry with him the memory of her who had taught him how deep and high, how wide and infinitely far-reaching that thing called love may really be. And Porges, dear, quaint, small Porges, where under heaven could he ever find again such utter faith, such pure, unaffected loyalty and devotion as throbbed within that small, warm heart? How could he ever bid good-bye to loving, eager, still, small Porges? And then there was Miss Priscilla, and the strong, gentle sergeant, and Peterday, and sturdy Adam, and Prudence, and the rosy-cheeked maids. How well they all suited this wonderful Arcadia! Yes, indeed he, and he only, had been out of place, and so he must go, back to the everyday, matter-of-fact world. But how could he ever say good-bye to faithful, loving, small Porges? Far in the east the grey streak had brightened and broadened, and was already tinged with a faint pink that deepened and deepened as he watched. Bellew had seen the glory of many a sunrises in divers wild places of the earth, and hitherto had always felt deep within him the responsive thrill, the exhilaration of hope new-born, and joyful expectation of the great unknown future. But now he watched the varying hues of pink and scarlet and saffron and gold with gloomy brow and sombre eyes. Now, presently, the blackbird who lived in the apple-tree beneath his window, the tree of the inquisitive turn of mind, this blackbird fellow, opening a drowsy eye, must needs give vent to a croak, very hoarse and feeble. Then, apparently having yawned prodigiously and stretched himself, wing and leg, he tried a couple of notes, in a hesitating, tentative sort of fashion, shook himself, repeated the 2 notes, tried 3, found them mellower and more what the waiting world very justly expected of him, grew more confident, tried 4, tried 5, grew perfectly assured, and so burst forth into the full golden melody of his morning song. Then Bellew, leaning out from his casement, as the first bright beams of the rising sun gilded the topmost leaves of the tree, thus apostrophized the unseen singer. "I suppose you will be piping away down in your tree there, old fellow, long after Arcadia has faded out of my life. Well, it'll be only natural and perfectly right, of course. She will be here, and may perhaps stop to listen to you. Now, if somehow you can manage to compose for me a song of memory some evening when I'm gone, some evening when she happens to be sitting idle and watching the moon rise over the upland yonder, if at such a time you could just manage to remind her of me, why, I'd thank you. And so, good-bye, old fellow." Saying which, Bellew turned from the window and took up a certain bulging, bestrapped portmanteau, while the blackbird, having evidently hearkened to his request with much grave attention, fell a-singing more gloriously than ever. Meanwhile Bellew descended the great wide stair, soft of foot and cautious of step, yet pausing once to look towards a certain closed door, and so presently let himself out into the dawn. The dew sparkled in the grass, it hung in glittering jewels from every leaf and twig, while now and then a shining drop would fall upon him as he passed, like a great tear. Now, as he reached the orchard, up rose the sun in all his majesty, filling the world with the splendour of his coming. Chapter 29 of The Money Moon by Jeffrey Farnol. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 29 of The Moon's Message to Small Porges, and how he told it to Bellew in a whisper. Bellew walked on at a good pace with his back turned resolutely towards the house of Dapplemere, and thus, as he swung into that narrow grassy lane that wound away between trees, he was much surprised to hear a distant hail. Facing sharp about, he espied a diminutive figure whose small legs trotted very fast and whose small fist waved a weather-beaten cap. Bellew's first impulse was to turn and run, but Bellew rarely acted on impulse. Therefore he set down the bulging portmanteau, seated himself upon it, and taking out pipe and tobacco, waited for his pursuer to come up. "Oh, Uncle Porges," panted a voice, "you did walk so awful fast, and I called and called, but you never heard. And now, please, where are you going?" "Going," said Bellew, searching through his pockets for a match. "Going, my Porges, why, for a stroll, to be sure. Just a walk before breakfast, you know." But then, why have you brought your bag?" "Bag?" repeated Bellew, stooping down to look at it. "Why, so I have." "Please, why?" persisted Small Porges, suddenly anxious. "Why did you bring it?" "Well, I expect it was to bear me company. But how is it you are out so very early, my Porges?" "Why, I couldn't sleep last night, you know, 'cause I kept on thinking and thinking about the fortune. So I got up in the middle of the night and dressed myself and sat in the big chair by the window and looked at the money moon. And I stared at it and stared at it till a wonderful thing happened." "And what do you suppose?" "I don't know. Well, all at once, while I stared up at it, the moon changed itself into a great big face, but I didn't mind a bit, because it was a very nice sort of face, rather like a gnome's face, only without the beard, you know. And when I looked at it, it talked to me, and it told me a lot of things, and that's how I know that you are going away, 'cause you are, you know, aren't you?" "Why, my Porges," said Bellew, fumbling with his pipe. "Why, shipmate, since you ask me, I am." "Yes, I was afraid the moon was right," said Small Porges, and turned away. But Bellew had seen the stricken look in his eyes. Therefore he took Small Porges in the circle of his big arm, and holding him thus, explained to him how that in this great world each of us must walk his appointed way, and that there must and always will be partings, but that also there must and always shall be meetings. "And so, my Porges, if we have to say good-bye now, the sooner we shall meet again, some day, somewhere." But Small Porges only sighed and shook his head in hopeless dejection. "Does she know you're going? I mean my Auntie Anthea?" "Oh, yes, she knows, Porges." "Then I suppose that's why she was crying so in the night." "Crying?" "Yes, she's cried an awful lot lately, hasn't she? Last night, when I woke up, you know, and couldn't sleep, I went into her room, and she was crying, with her face hidden in the pillow, and her hair all about her." "Crying?" "Yes, and she said she wished she was dead. So then, of course, I tried to comfort her, you know, and she said, 'I'm a dreadful failure, Georgie dear, with the farm and everything else. I've tried to be a father and mother to you, and I've failed in that too. So now I'm going to give you a real father.' And she told me she was going to marry Mr. Cassilis. But I said no, 'cause I'd arranged for her to marry you and live happy ever after. But she got awful angry again and said she'd never marry you if you were the last man in the world, 'cause she despised you so." "And that would seem to settle it," nodded Bellew gloomily. "So it's good-bye, my Porges. We may as well shake hands now and get it over." And Bellew rose from the portmanteau, and sighing, held out his hand. "Oh, but wait a minute," cried Small Porges eagerly. "I haven't told you what the moon said to me last night." "Ah, to be sure, we were forgetting that," said Bellew, with an absent look, and a trifle wearily. "Why then, please sit down again so I can speak into your ear, 'cause what the moon told me to tell you was a secret, you know." Chapter 30 of The Money Moon by John Jeffrey Farnol. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 30. How Anthea Gave Her Promise. "And so he is really gone?" Miss Priscilla sighed as she spoke, and looked up from her needlework to watch Anthea, who sat biting her pen and frowning down at the blank sheet of paper before her. "And so he is really gone?" "Who, Mr. Bellew? Oh, yes." "He went very early?" "Yes." "And without any breakfast?" "That was his own fault," said Anthea. "Without even saying good-bye?" "Perhaps he was in a hurry," Anthea suggested. "Oh, dear me, no, my dear. I don't believe Mr. Bellew was ever in a hurry in all his life." "No," said Anthea, giving her pen a vicious bite. "I don't believe he ever was. He's always so hatefully placid and deliberate." And here she bit her pen again. "Eh, my dear?" exclaimed Miss Priscilla, pausing with her needle in mid-air. "Did you say hatefully?" "Yes." "Anthea? I hate him, Aunt Priscilla." "Eh, my dear?" "That was why I sent him away." "You sent him away?" "Yes." "But, Anthea, why?" "Oh, Aunt Priscilla, surely you never believed in the fortune? Surely you guessed it was his money that paid back the mortgage? Didn't you, Aunt? Didn't you?" "Well, my dear, but then he did it so very tactfully, and I'd hoped, my dear, that I should marry him and settle the obligation that way, perhaps." "Well, yes, my dear, I did hope so." "Oh, I'm going to marry—" "Then why did you send—" "I'm going to marry Mr. Cassilis whenever he pleases." "Anthea!" The word was a cry, and her needlework slipped from Miss Priscilla's nerveless fingers. "He asked me to write and tell him if I change my mind." "Oh, my dear, my dear!" cried Miss Priscilla, reaching out imploring hands. "You never mean it. You are distraught today, tired and worn out with worry and loss of sleep. Wait." "Wait," repeated Anthea bitterly. "For what?" "To marry him. Oh, Anthea, you never meant it. Think what you are doing." "I thought of it all last night, Aunt Priscilla, and all this morning, and I have made up my mind." "You mean to write?" "Yes." "To tell Mr. Cassilis that you will marry him?" "Yes." But now Miss Priscilla rose, and next moment was kneeling beside Anthea's chair. "Oh, my dear," she pleaded, "you that I love like my own flesh and blood, don't! Oh, Anthea, don't do what can never be undone. Don't give your youth and beauty to one who can never make you happy. Oh, Anthea!" "Dear Aunt Priscilla, I would rather marry one I don't love than have to live beholden all my days to a man that I hate." Now as she spoke, though her embrace was as ready and her hands as gentle as ever, yet Miss Priscilla saw that her proud face was set and stern. So she presently rose, sighing, and taking her little crutch stick, tapped dolefully away, and left Anthea to write her letter. And now, hesitating no more, Anthea took up her pen and wrote. Surely a very short missive for a love letter. And when she had folded and sealed it, she tossed it aside, and laying her arms upon the table, hid her face with a long, shuddering sigh. In a little while she rose, and taking up the letter, went out to find Adam. But remembering that he had gone to Cranbrook with small Porges, she paused irresolute, and then turned her steps toward the orchard. Hearing voices, she stopped again, and glancing about, espied the sergeant and Miss Priscilla. She had given both her hands into the sergeant's one great solitary fist, and he was looking down at her, and she was looking up at him, and upon the face of each was a great and shining joy. And seeing all this, Anthea felt herself very lonely all at once, and turning aside saw all things through a blur of sudden tears. She was possessed also of a sudden fierce loathing of the future, a horror because of the promise her letter contained. Nevertheless she was firm and resolute on her course, because of the pride that burned within her. So thus it was that as the sergeant presently came striding along on his homeward way, he was suddenly aware of Miss Anthea standing before him, whereupon he halted, and removing his hat, wished her a "Good afternoon." "Sergeant," said she, "will you do something for me?" "Anything you ask me, Miss Anthea, ma'am, ever and always." "I want you to take this letter to Mr. Cassilis. Will you?" The sergeant hesitated unwontedly, turning his hat about and about in his hand. Finally he put it on, out of the way. "Will you, sergeant?" "Since you ask me, Miss Anthea, ma'am, I will." "Give it into his own hand." "Miss Anthea, ma'am, I will." "Thank you. Here it is, sergeant." And so she turned and was gone, leaving the sergeant staring down at the letter in his hand and shaking his head over it. Anthea walked on hastily, never looking behind, and so coming back to the house, threw herself down by the open window and stared out with unseeing eyes at the roses nodding slumberous heads in the gentle breeze. So the irrevocable step was taken. She had given her promise to marry Cassilis whenever he would, and must abide by it. Too late now, any hope of retreat. She had deliberately chosen her course, and must follow it to the end. "Begging your pardon, Miss Anthea, ma'am." She started, and glancing round, espied Adam. Oh, you startled me, Adam. What is it?
Begging your pardon, Miss Anthea, but is it true as Mr. Bellew be gone away, for good?
Yes, Adam.
Why, then all I can say is as I'm sorry. Mortal sorry I be, and my heart, ma'am, my heart likewise gloomy.
Were you so fond of him, Adam?
Well, Miss Anthea, concerning as he were the best, good-naturedest, properest kind of gentleman as ever was, when I tell you as over and above all this, he could use his fist better than any man as ever I see, him having knocked me down into a dry ditch, though to be sure I likewise drawed his claret. Begging your pardon, I'm sure, Miss Anthea. All of what happened on account of me finding him asleeping in your air, ma'am. When I tell you furthermore, as he treated me ever as a man, and weren't no ways above shaking me hand or smoking a pipe with me, sociable like, when I tell you as he were the finest gentleman and properest man as ever I knowed, or heard tell on, why I think as the word fond be about the size of it, Miss Anthea, ma'am.
Saying which, Adam nodded several times, and bestowed an emphatic backhanded knock to the crown of his hat. You used to sit together very often under the big apple tree, didn't you, Adam?
Many and many a night, Miss Anthea.
Did he ever tell you much of his life, Adam?
Why, yes, Miss Anthea. Told me somewhat about his travels. Told me as he'd shot lions and tigers way out in India and Africa.
Did he ever mention...
Well, Miss Anthea,
said he inquiringly, seeing she had paused. Did he ever speak of the lady he's going to marry?
Lady?
Repeated Adam, giving a sudden twist to his hat. Yes, the lady who lives in London.
No, Miss Anthea,
answered Adam, screwing his hat tighter and tighter. Why, what do you mean?
I mean, as there never was no lady, Miss Anthea, neither up in London nor nowheres else, as I ever heard on.
But, oh, Adam, you told me.
For sure I told ye, but it were a lie, Miss Anthea. Leastwise, it weren't the truth. You see, I were afraid as you'd refuse to take the money for the furniture, unless I make ye believe as he wanted it uncommon bad. So I up and told you as he bought it all on account of him being matrimonially took with a young lady up in London.
And then you went to him and warned him, told him of the story you had invented?
I did, Miss Anthea. First I thought as he were going to up and give me one for myself, but afterwards he took it very quiet and told me as I'd done quite right and agreed to play the game. That's all about it, and glad I am as to be off my mind at last. Now, Miss Anthea, ma'am, seeing you're that rich with Master George's fortune, why you can pay back for the furniture, if so be you're minded to, and I hope as you agree with me as I've done it all for the best, Miss Anthea.
Here Adam unscrewed his hat and knocked out the wrinkles against his knee, which done, he glanced at Anthea.
Why, what is it, Miss Anthea?
Nothing, Adam. I haven't slept well lately, that's all.
Ah, well, you'll be all right again now. We all shall, now the mortgage be paid off. Shan't we, Miss Anthea?
Yes, Adam.
We had a great day over to Cranbrook, Master Georgie and me. He be in the kitchen now with Prudence, eating of bread and jam. Good night, Miss Anthea, ma'am. If you be wanting me again, I shall be in the stables. Good night, Miss Anthea.
So honest, well-meaning Adam touched his forehead with a square-ended finger and trudged away. But Anthea sat there very still with drooping head and vacant eyes. And so it was done. The irrevocable step had been taken. She had given her promise. So now, having chosen her course, she must follow it to the end. For in Arcadia it would seem that a promise is still a sacred thing. Now in a while, lifting her eyes, they encountered those of the smiling cavalier above the mantel. Then as she looked, she stretched out her arms with a sudden yearning gesture. "Oh," she whispered, "if I were only just a picture, like you." End of chapter 30.